Our story begins in 1948 in Birmingham, the industrial heart of England. Post-World War II England was a gray, smoky, and noisy place. Young Tony Iommi grew up in the shadow of these massive factories. The rhythmic, metallic sounds of these factories were actually the subconscious foundation of the riffs he would write in the future. Birmingham at that time was not just producing metal, but also anger, frustration, and a desire to escape. Tony saw music as a way of salvation and picked up the guitar at a young age. However, fate had a cruel surprise prepared for him. Those smoky factories would both give him his inspiration and steal his fingers. Tony was only 17 years old. It was his last day at the factory because he was dreaming of becoming a full-time musician. However, in a moment of inattention, a metal press machine ripped off the tips of the middle and ring fingers of his right hand. Doctors gave him the painful news: "You will never be able to play guitar again." This was like a death sentence for a musician. Tony was devastated. His world had come crashing down. But at that dark moment, a friend played him a recording of Django Reinhardt. Upon learning that Django played incredible solos with only 2 fingers, the fire that was about to go out inside Tony flared up again. "If he could do it, I can too," he said.
Tony didn't give up. He melted dish soap bottles from home, shaped them into fingertips, and glued pieces of leather over them. He became an inventor, creating his own prosthetics. But there was a problem. It was impossible to press standard guitar strings with these hard prosthetics, and it hurt a lot. This is exactly where the cornerstone of heavy metal was laid. Tony lowered the tuning of the guitar, down-tuning, to reduce the pressure on the strings. When the strings loosened, the sound became darker, heavier, and more lumbering. He had accidentally found heavy metal's famous bone-shaking tone. Had this accident not happened, that legendary dark tone might never have been heard.
Tony formed a band called Earth with Bill Ward, Geezer Butler, and Ozzy Osbourne. Initially, they were playing blues and jazz. However, while practicing one day, they noticed people queuing in front of the cinema across the street. People were paying money to watch a horror movie. Geezer Butler said, "If people pay to be scared, then we should make scary music." One day, Iommi played the famous Black Sabbath riff in the rehearsal room. In that moment, the room turned ice cold. He had used the tritone, known as the devil's interval. This dissonant and chilling sound was the first real note of modern heavy metal. Earth was finished, and Black Sabbath was born. On a Friday in 1970, also Friday the 13th, Black Sabbath released their self-titled debut album. The recording process was incredible. The entire album was recorded live in just 12 hours. They entered the studio, played, and left. Critics hated the album, but listeners were mesmerized. The Maple Durham watermill, where the mysterious woman on the album cover stood, became a symbol of the gothic and horror-filled atmosphere in the band's music. When Iommi's riffs combined with Ozzy's wailing vocals, the world was shaken with a weight it had never heard before. No one thought such a sound could be possible. Just 4 months after the first album, they returned to the studio. Initially, the album was going to be called War Pigs, but the record company feared references to the Vietnam War and changed the name to Paranoid. The hit track Paranoid was actually a filler song written in 20 minutes just to extend the album's length. However, that simple riff turned Tony Iommi into a worldwide star. Iron Man possessed the most iconic riff of all time. Iommi was no longer just a guitarist. He was a riff factory. With the Paranoid album, Black Sabbath climbed to the top of the charts and set the standards for heavy metal. The greatest symbol that comes to mind when Tony Iommi is mentioned is that famous cherry red Gibson SG, nicknamed JD or Monkey. The horn structure of the SG was in perfect harmony with Sabbath's dark image. Iommi modified this guitar according to his own needs. He used a special design to use the frets more comfortably. His tone was so characteristic that the sound coming from his amp was as powerful and sharp as a drill boring through concrete. The Gibson company would produce special models in his name years later, but that rusty and old SG would remain the holy grail of heavy metal. By 1971, Sabbath made their sound even heavier with Master of Reality. To further reduce the pressure on his fingers, Iommi tuned his guitar down 3 semitones to C, C sharp. This added a massive, sludgy, and dense feel to the music. The album, which starts with the sound of a cough at the beginning of the track Sweet Leaf, also laid the foundations for stoner rock and doom metal.
Iommi had not only invented heavy metal, but had also sown the seeds of its subgenres. The riffs on this album were so heavy, it felt as if the speakers could not handle the load.
In music theory, the tritone, augmented fourth, was an interval forbidden by the church in the Middle Ages because it was believed this sound summoned the devil. Iommi placed this harmonic structure at the center of his music, consciously or unconsciously. He was the man who broke down the familiar structure of the blues and extracted the darkness from within it. The chromatic progressions and unexpected chord transitions he used in his compositions evoked a sense of unease and admiration in the listener. This technique created that unique horror music aesthetic that bears Iommi's signature. He used notes like weapons. Black Sabbath was now one of the biggest bands in the world. However, this success brought great chaos with it. Alcohol, drugs, and endless tours were wearing the band down. But Tony Iommi was the fixer and leader of the band. While other members were passed out, he continued to work on riffs in the studio. Without Iommi, the band would have disbanded long ago. He served as the engine of Sabbath with his discipline and unwavering commitment to music. Thousands of people filling stadiums on American tours were actually falling under the spell of Iommi's guitar sounds, built like a massive wall. In 1973, the band holed up in Clearwell Castle for their fifth album. However, for the first time in his life, Iommi faced writer's block regarding riffs. He couldn't come up with anything for days, which drove him crazy. The dungeon-like atmosphere of the castle had stressed everyone out. One evening, when he found that famous Sabbath Bloody Sabbath riff, the band came back to life. This riff is one of Iommi's favorites because it saved the band's career. The sound, expanded with Rick Wakeman's keyboards on the album, also revealed Iommi's progressive and experimental side. He wasn't just playing heavy, he was turning music into a work of art. Towards the end of the 70s, the band began to drift apart. Iommi wanted to expand the band's sound with keyboards and cleaner productions. However, this situation split the fans on the Never Say Die and Technical Ecstasy albums. The tension between Ozzy and Tony had peaked. Tony was always a perfectionist, working for hours on a single note in the studio. Ozzy's lack of discipline had become unbearable. In 1979, Tony made the decision to fire Ozzy, the founder and heart of the band. This was a decision that seemed impossible for the music world, but Iommi's vision told him not to stop. With Ozzy's departure, everyone thought Sabbath was over, but Tony Iommi had another plan: Ronnie James Dio. Dio's operatic and powerful vocals added a new dimension to Iommi's riffs. When the Heaven and Hell album was released in 1980, Black Sabbath was reborn from its ashes. The riffs were faster, more melodic, and more epic. With his harmony with Dio, Tony changed the course of heavy metal once again. This period was the greatest proof of Iommi's technical skill and how he could adapt to different vocalists. The tracks Neon Nights and Heaven and Hell became instant classics. The 80s were tough for Sabbath and Iommi. Dio left the band and was replaced by Ian Gillan, Deep Purple. With the Born Again album, Iommi presented perhaps one of the heaviest tones of his career. In the following years, he worked with names like Glenn Hughes and Tony Martin. The lineups were constantly changing, but only one thing remained constant: Iommi's riffs. In the albums The Eternal Idol and Headless Cross, Tony managed to maintain that dark and melodic power of heavy metal. Many people said to him, Black Sabbath is now like a solo project, but Tony carried the name Black Sabbath and that legacy alone on his shoulders. Throughout Iommi's career, his biggest rival was his own fingers. His prosthetics were constantly wearing out, slipping due to sweat under stage lights or softening from the heat. He had to tape his fingers and prepare those prosthetics every night on tour. Sometimes a prosthetic would fly off on stage, causing him great pain, but he never let the audience know. He is the world's greatest proof that physical disabilities cannot stop an artist. Every time he played a solo, it was actually a slap in the face to the medical world and his fate. He managed to become one of the best guitarists in the world without fingertips. In 2012, the world was shaken by shocking news. Tony Iommi was diagnosed with lymphoma, right at the time when the original lineup, except Bill Ward, was reuniting to record the new album, 13. Tony continued to go to the studio while receiving chemotherapy. He didn't put down his guitar even when facing death. The riffs he wrote during this process were perhaps his darkest and deepest.
Tony treated his illness with his music. He was the symbol of an unshakable will. Cancer tried to slow him down, but he found the strength in himself to go on the End Tour and greet the world once more.
The album 13, recorded under the production of Rick Rubin, was a tribute to Black Sabbath's roots. Tony returned to that lumbering, dark, and dirty tone of the first albums. Those massive riffs, combined with Ozzy's voice, proved to the world once again why the band is a legend. The album hit #1 on charts worldwide. For Tony Iommi, this was the piece of finishing what he started at the peak. With tracks like God is Dead, they managed to bring that mystical and chilling atmosphere of the 70s into the modern era. Iommi's genius was timeless. On February 4th, 2017, in Birmingham, the city where they were born, Black Sabbath gave their final concert. When the End Tour concluded, the founders of heavy metal had bid farewell to the stage. When Tony Iommi struck his last note, thousands of people were in tears. He had completed his duty as that young worker who came out of the factories of Birmingham and changed the world. However, this was not an end, but a declaration of immortality. Although Iommi no longer tours actively, his riffs continue to live on in the DNA of every new heavy metal band. He handed over his legacy to safe hands. Today, every great guitarist from James Hetfield to Slash, from Tom Morello to Zakk Wylde, sees Tony Iommi as their greatest inspiration. That deficiency in his fingertips had created that immense abundance in music. Modern metal, doom, sludge, and stoner genres all ignited with that first spark coming from Iommi's SG guitar. Iommi taught us that riffs are not just notes, but a feeling, an atmosphere, and a storytelling tool. He is the greatest riff lord in history and the eternal architect of heavy metal. In conclusion, the name Tony Iommi represents not just a musician, but a revolution. We learned from him how to overcome obstacles and how to turn a tragedy into a world legacy. This path from a factory accident to rock godhood is a guide for all musicians. The riff lord is still among us, still polishing his legendary SG. And who knows, maybe one day those dark sounds will rise again from those massive speakers. Sabbath will last forever. Iommi will never be forgotten. Hail to the father of heavy metal. Thanks for watching. Stay metal.